Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today, as a Patreon request from Leo Fredholm, I'm talking about the 2009 soundtrack album from Tomáš Dvořák, aka Floex, for the game Machinarium. You know, this was one of those requests that I initially thought was going to have a certain amount of stakes to it, and I ended up very much misjudging it. When this was sent in, I thought, on one hand, hey, it's another project from Floex, an artist I've come to enjoy quite a bit ever since the same guy who sent this request in also sent in a request about 2 years ago for Floex's 2011 album Zorya, which legit absolutely floored me and is one of the best albums I've discovered through these Patreon requests at all. A fantastically well-detailed blend of IDM, modern classical, and jazz with super dense instrumental blends that have so much going on and such a wide variety of different sounds, but never to the point where it feels like density for its own sake, and all of it always came in direct service to the core emotions each track was trying to convey. If you missed my review of that, worth going back to. I stand by the album being excellent, and it has continued to stick with me. And if I may digress for a bit, since making that video I have also listened to the other 2 studio albums he has to his name, neither of which are as good as Zorya, but are still very good. His debut, Pocus Tone from 2001, has way more obviously cheap and almost garage bandish production, and a less structured sound that hadn't been fully realized yet, but still clearly hints at the instrumental ambition he would go on to show later, and is still pretty solid if you're looking for something on the loungier side. And he has one collab album with Tom Hodge and the Prague Radio Symphony Orchestra called A Portrait of John Doe from 2018, which was more or less the same kind of stuff as heard on Zorya, though leaning even further into the classical and orchestral elements, as you might be able to guess. That was pretty damn impressive too, even if it could run together a bit for me and maybe wasn't as melodically strong. But that's his entire studio album discography, and while he's released a decent bit of music outside of that, everything else is exclusively soundtrack work, specifically video game soundtracks. And this is where maybe I did feel a bit of apprehension at being sent this request initially. I have allowed requests for soundtrack albums a number of times in the past, but I do always tend to feel very limited when talking about those, since they're not meant to stand alone and often don't work as well when judged out of context of whatever other medium they're really meant to be digested in. So when that request was first sent in, I thought, well, this is an artist I know delivers quality work on the few regular albums he has, though I don't know if I'm all that excited to talk about some random soundtrack work he happened to release on the side, even if it is a very popular one. What I didn't realize at the time the request was sent in is that this soundtrack in particular is actually Floex's primary claim to fame over literally anything else he's done. When I looked back at the comments of my Zorya review, a lot of them weren't even talking about Zorya at all, they were talking about the Machinarium soundtrack. And in fact, many commenters had only heard the Machinarium soundtrack without even having heard Zorya, despite all the acclaim that got. As far as I can tell, Machinarium is the highest profile thing Floex's name has been attached to, and is easily his most popular and well-remembered work. In fact, it's so well-remembered that 10 years after the game and soundtrack were released, there was a short remix album to mark the anniversary, and he brought in C418 and freaking Orbital, among others, to reimagine the compositions. And he even just recently announced a very small US tour with an ensemble playing compositions from this soundtrack, among other soundtracks he's worked on, like Samarast and Papatura, now 15 years after Machinarium's original release. Yeah, so this game might have been a bigger deal than I thought. In fact, the more I looked into the game, the more I had to wonder how it took me such a long time to have heard of Machinarium in the first place, what with it being arguably the most famous work to come out of the Amanita Design Studio, of which Floex is apparently a core official member as sound design and CFO. I had actually heard of Amanita Design in passing many years ago, thanks to my being a hardcore fan of Matthew Skutnik's Submachine and Daymare Town series. They're often brought up in the same breath as, like, you like one and you like the other. Same genre of puzzle-heavy point-and-click adventure games that clearly come from developers who came up within the old Flash game infrastructure. I feel like I should have been part of the exact target demographic that Machinarium had been designed to appeal to, even if back in 2009 I was a broke middle schooler who would not have been shelling out $20 for that. It looked like the exact kind of thing that, had I looked into it in high school, I might have ended up really messing with it, or possibly even having a big long-term favorite. So yes, for the sake of giving this video some actual substance that I don't know if I would have been able to provide in the same way otherwise, I did actually buy the game and play through it myself. In fact, I have played through it in full 3 times as of recording this, which is less impressive than that might sound. The game can easily be completed 100% in an afternoon, or even in as short as 2 hours if you're replaying it and know everything to do ahead of time. Also, I am not a real gamer, and I am not above consulting a walkthrough when I get stuck. Now, I do think the game is really solid if you're into that particular genre of point-and-click adventure, though there are a lot of aspects about it that haven't aged as well as you would think. I can deal with the paper-thin Mario saves the princess from one-dimensional evil dude's plot. I suppose there's only so much story you can tell without having any dialogue at all like they did, even if there was probably room within the medium they gave themselves to, say, give the villains any kind of motivation at all besides evil for evil's sake, or do something with the girlfriend character outside of trapping her in a goddamn kitchen. There are puzzles in the kitchen, so she technically does something, but boy was that fucking on the nose. And I can deal with the fact that some puzzles had some less than intuitive solutions that I probably would not have been able to come up with on my own. That kind of comes with the territory for that genre and era, and even the solutions that felt the most out of left field in the moment at least had some logic to them that made sense in hindsight. What I didn't really like about the game was the fact that at least a third to seemingly almost half the game takes you out of the environment for the sake of somewhat generic mini-games or puzzles that would have felt more at home in the context of like a Professor Layton game or something. Here's a bit where you play Peg Solitaire. Here's a maze bit where you have to turn on all the lights. Here's a sliding tile puzzle. Here's a Sokoban type puzzle. Here's a bit where you play like 5 full rounds of vanilla Space Invaders. Not a puzzle, but you get what I mean. Most of these mini-games are perfectly fine on their own. I do say this as a longtime Professor Layton fan. But they're not as interesting as the core environmental interaction-based gameplay, and the sheer quantity of them borders on distracting from the game's core appeal. Also, there were a couple that actively got on my nerves. Especially the fucking 5-in-a-row tic-tac-toe minigame. There is no reason for that bit to have been so freaking hard, while also being necessary to progress. Easily the worst part of the entire game, and I kinda had to make this whole digression just to rant about that fucking minigame in particular. For a game about robots and machines, Machinarium isn't really the kind of game whose appeal lies in the actual mechanics of its gameplay, so much as it is about the heart and soul behind its look and feel and aesthetic. It's got a particularly unique art style that's hard to describe, seems halfway between being hand-drawn and oddly realistic looking as if some elements were cut out of pieces of photographs. Both kind of uncanny but also charming in its own odd way. The whole steampunk/diesel punk environment of everything is really immersive and interesting, enough so to be the game's obvious selling point. And of course, getting back on topic to the request at hand, the soundtrack really adds to the experience in its own interesting way too, that perfectly fits the aesthetic of this small town of robots and machines that all act more like people and animals and other living creatures. You can tell that Floex was pretty intimately part of the game development process. If I just listened to the soundtrack on its own without experiencing it in the context of the game, which I did for my very first listen, I would have liked it, but I don't know if I would have really understood the hype for it in the same way. As a regular album, it's a nice collection of ambience and low-key glitch hop and IDM elements, though leaning much more heavily into the ambient side of things than Floex's standalone artist albums do, and unsurprisingly feeling kinda background music-y on average. So getting to hear it paired with the particularly unique visual style of the game does in fact make a big difference. It also ended up serving as insight into how this soundtrack album was actually designed as a standalone experience, since the album doesn't exactly follow the game soundtrack one-to-one. There are a small handful of tracks that are somewhat remixed from the versions that appear in the game, for instance, Nanorobot Tune. There's a couple of tracks that only appear in the game and not on the album, or its complimentary bonus EP, which I'll get into later. And I'm pretty sure there's 2 tracks on the album that don't even appear in the game at all. I could not identify where the mezzanine appears in the game. It might be from the very beginning tutorial area, but I'm not sure if that's the same track. Hard to tell since it's kind of a generic, formless ambient piece without much of any distinct musical elements to latch onto. And the much more obviously distinct Game Boy tune definitely does not appear in the game, at least not anywhere I heard. There's multiple video game within a video game sections in this game where it would have fit, and none of them used that particular track. All of that does seem to imply to me that this soundtrack album was in fact mindful of how it would be digested as a regular album first and foremost, and I don't know if I would have been able to pick up on that without playing the game. So, with all that out of the way, let's finally talk about the actual contents of this soundtrack album. And let's begin by noting that the album has a really strong start. The Bottom is an excellent two-part opener that grabs your attention right off the bat with a really organic and uplifting mix of bright dulcimer melodies and kalimbas going in next to all the warm synth textures, while the second half goes much more dark ambient with some more minimal piano performances. It almost kind of sounds like the two parts would soundtrack two completely different areas, although they are clearly interconnected to make sense as one track. And in fact, the entire track only appears in one screen early in the game. Also, the two halves are reversed in the game, with the second half playing first and the first half only playing if you wait around for like 3 minutes. Which was the right call both in terms of how it fits in the game and in the album. First half is a more attention-grabbing way to start the album, while the second half fit the mood of that particular area better. Honestly, kinda wish the game came back to that track more in general, but whatever, really strong start. Another one of my big favorites was following track The Sea, probably the single warmest and most peaceful track to show up on the album, and that is saying something. Just a really pretty, expansive, and well-layered mix of major key synth pads with a few fluttering woodwinds and maybe some harps for good measure to accompany it. Also a mildly organic beat with a lot of triangles in it comes in as well for the track's second half. That was really freaking nice. Although not every track on this thing hits for me on as strong a note as those first two. And there are a few moments on the album that can still run together a bit. Clockwise Operetta definitely fits well for that part of the game where you're, like, by yourself, stuck in the villain's base of operations, and carries that kind of unnerving and downbeat atmosphere. Some nice string parts in that one and a bit of cool text-to-speech voice singing. Though it doesn't strike me as a major standout, and I do feel like there are a number of other tracks here that can hit on a somewhat similar note. Nanorobot Tune is a somewhat interesting blend of blubbering dub techno synths, and the album version adds on plenty of glitchy IDM percussion workouts to give it more of an identity compared to the beatless version that appears in the game, though there isn't that much of an actual tune behind that one. And the mezzanine, as mentioned above, is just kind of a generic dark ambient cut, which, despite having some mildly cool sound design layers and feels like it serves its purpose as a quick breather interlude on the album, was so indistinct I couldn't figure out where or even if it appears in the game at all. I don't think it will surprise anyone to hear that that was my least favorite cut on the album. I did quite like Mr. Handagote, though. The various lo-fi synth arpeggios and bells and pizzicato strings going in the mix on that one make for one of the catchier and more memorable tunes on display in the game, and I think this album version also gives the track more of a pulse through some stronger beat work. Very much hits for me in the same way as the first half of The Bottom, albeit with more of a minor key mood. And Game Boy Tune is quite nice as well, much more pleasant major key tune with lots of warm and varied layers of buzzing chiptune synths. Odd that it doesn't appear in the game that I could tell. There are multiple places where it would have fit, like that arcade scene, or heck, it could have fit well as the staff credits from how cheerful the melodies are, but nope, it's just not there, and I feel like I definitely would have remembered it if it was. Either way, good track, if not necessarily a major favorite. It kind of just started blending in the background the more times I put the album on. On the flip side, following track The Furnace is probably the track that grew on me the most over time. That one starts out with all these barely tonal metallic synths just kind of adding up to that steamy and unnerving vibe fit for that particular screen in the game, although it slowly and gradually evolves into this surprisingly warm and friendly jazzy piano tune that brings in all these light acoustic guitars and a bit of vibraphones. As if the furnace on that screen was like a family fireplace or something. And that takes us to the shortest song on the album, our villain theme song, the Black Cap Brotherhood theme. And despite its length, chances are if there's literally any track from this game that is most likely to linger in your mind for a long time after you've played it, it is going to be this one. That quirky little descending bass line is by far the catchiest melody on the entire soundtrack, and it's not even remotely close. I have been humming that shit to myself for days. And you won't even realize it at first, since the theme seems pretty subtle and stripped back. It's a well-fitting theme song for a bunch of shady, robotic middle school bullies who sneak around and do evil shit, I guess. But it just sticks in the head like nothing else in the soundtrack, and they clearly knew what an earworm they had on their hands, since that's the track that actually plays over the staff credits at the end. You wouldn't think it would make sense to play the villain theme over the credits, but low-key it kind of makes sense from the catchiness alone. Thankfully, it is not catchy in the annoying way, at least not yet. Maybe I'll get to that point with it later, but as of now, it's one of the most obvious highlights. Nobody is going to forget that one. Less so the case for following track The Prison, one of the emptiest sounding dark ambient cuts, whose most distinct instrumental element is some whispering text-to-speech voices in the background and bass rumbling. Though it's more memorable than I might have just made it sound. It might stand out for being the emptiest cut in the bunch, like it's just making good use of that near-dead silence to fit the pitch blackness of that particular scene. But then we get a big fan favorite and clear highlight, the Glasshouse with Butterfly, another really subtle track that seems to have an especially dour and sad tone on the surface, but just hits on this oddly soothing and comforting note with all its not really woodwind bass and guitar plucking, building into all these warm harp and piano progressions, while surrounded by all this lo-fi vinyl crackling. Exceptionally pretty stuff, and while I was hearing it in the game on my first playthrough while trying to get through that freaking lights on puzzle, I was just savoring the mood this track created. It made me not mind the parts where I felt like I'd gotten somewhat stuck. If you're looking for something with a Huerco-S for those of you who have never type vibe, but with more live instrumentation, this'll hit the spot for you quite well, I think. And while I'm at it, this is also the track that Orbital remixed, so of course I made sure to listen to that on the side as well. They didn't actually do that much with the track, besides add a somewhat simple dance beat to it and give everything more of a pulse. I actually found it a bit underwhelming on first listen, but it did grow on me, and chances are, if that remix had been like the original version and I had just heard Orbital release it out of context as if it were their own track, I'd have found it to be like the most mind-blowing shit ever. Happy to live in a universe where that crossover happened twice in any case. I have not heard any of the other remixes for this album, but I figured people would be asking me about that one in particular for obvious reasons. Moving on from there, it's time to raise the dramatic stakes somewhat as we move into The Castle. That one definitely has a pretty chilling effect and makes you feel like, oh, we're getting into the late game now, right away. The way those little harpsichords and pizzicato strings layer over each other and even build up some very mild distorted noise before reaching another all-ambient second half has a very spooky feel to it. Guess it'll fit well for the Halloween season coming around or something, I don't know. And similar feelings on following track The Elevator, the longest cut in the bunch at over 7 minutes. Although that is somewhat misleading to say, as this track is actually 4 completely different tracks from the game mashed together into one. Obviously it starts with the actual theme from The Elevator, which might be the single spookiest theme in the game over even The Castle. Just those single harpsichord notes and pitch-bent violins feel so unnervingly empty and paranoia-inducing, like there's some kind of big danger right around the corner where you wouldn't be able to see it. Even though that's not really the case in the game, and there is some slightly more pleasant ambience built up right after that really creepy beginning. The other themes included in this track include the completely tuneless drone of machine noises and bleeps that plays in that area at the very top of the tower with that one dude that looks like he's wearing a giant VR helmet, but that's actually just his head. There's the abstract drone piece that actually plays in the arcade room, with lots more bleeping patterns and vinyl crackling and maybe another blip of the Texas speech voice, but again, not really an actual tune. And finally, a whole bunch of radio static that plays in that area that has the robot band in it, but before any of them can play any of their instruments. All these match together in the same track, and what's funny is that if I had not played the game, I might not have even picked up that it was supposed to be a medley of multiple themes thanks to how formless and structureless all the parts are. May as well just be a single spooky, near amelodic sound design excursion. So, not really a major favorite if I'm being honest, but, an interesting way to execute all those ideas in the context of an album, I suppose. Finally, the album fittingly closes with The End, Prague Radio. I'm not actually sure why it's called The End outside of arbitrarily being chosen as the last song on the album, since it plays closer to the early middle part of the game, in like the oil bar where the dreaded tic-tac-toe minigame takes place. It's also technically not a song by Floex at all, it's instead by this guy whose name I am not even going to try to pronounce. I think that might be why the track isn't included on the album at all on a few specific streaming services, though it's not the same across all streaming services, so I don't know. Regardless, even though this may feel like an odd choice for a finisher on paper, I'm totally game for it, and this is actually another one of my Big Easy favorites, despite being the soundtrack to my least favorite part of the game by a long shot. Somehow just hearing those nice and relaxed bossa nova guitar arrangements with all the jazzy upright bass and piano perfectly set the right laid-back mood to partially soften the blow of repeatedly getting my ass thoroughly handed to me in fucking tic-tac-toe. Even prevented me from getting really pissed off until losing like my 7th time in a row thanks to this song being such a nice mood in the background. It hits on the same kind of nostalgic and cozy vibe for me that like the Me Channel theme can hit for me, I guess. I may not be glad for that specific part of the game, but I am glad for that song being in the game. I think it's very well implemented, and I think it ends off this album quite nicely. Though while that's everything on the album itself, I feel like I would also be remiss if I didn't mention the bonus EP, which is currently a free download on Floex's Bandcamp page, and includes 5 additional tracks. Especially considering the 5 tracks in question all come from extremely key moments in the game that would leave anyone who played the game themselves legit baffled as to how any of them were ever left off the album in the first place. Like, I guess more 4 of the 5 tracks are like that. The Defusing the Bomb theme is just a sped-up version of Clockwise Operetta and isn't anything essential. But all the others come from all the most memorable moments of the game and are big enough standouts where I might even possibly get a comparable amount of enjoyment out of this EP on its own as I do out of the standard edition of the album. Maybe. The Robot Band tune was the one moment I came across in the game that most had me like, yep, the guy behind this soundtrack is definitely the same guy who made Zoria. Getting a tune from this 3-piece band who play on an oil drum, a saxophone, and their resplendent didgeridoo respectively, and it absolutely slaps. As does Pipe Wrench Dubstep, probably the biggest banger to show up in the game, honestly. It's got lots of heavier and more fast-paced dance beats with squelchy bass and lots of bright and cheerful steel drum melodies. Both of these 2 tracks are moments where you're likely to just stop moving by choice and just let the main character jam out with whoever else is on screen at the moment. That was some good shit, and the dancing animations in the game were cute. Game in the Brain is another one of those video game within a video game moments, but that one has much more actual plot importance than the random arcade games you have to do on the side. While I'd be lying if I said I loved that particular minigame, I think that was the specific moment that had me like, wow, this game has so many minigames in it. The chiptune track that plays underneath it is pretty tense and exciting, and it makes it feel like something really important is going down despite the instrumental simplicity. I think I actually like that tune a little more than Game Boy tune, though it is pretty close. But as strong as those tracks are, I don't think it'll be any surprise to hear that the biggest head-scratcher as to how a track got excluded from the album proper is By the Wall. I've seen so many people highlight that track in particular as their favorite track to come out of the entire soundtrack, and it might even be the most popular pick for favorite cut out of them all. This is the moment that soundtracks like a brief reunion scene where the main character gets to briefly meet up with his girlfriend through a window but he can't save her yet. And of course a scene like that is backed by this super tender and emotional ambient piano piece that hits one of the absolute strongest emotional notes out of any track in this soundtrack. Just perfectly conveys that particular emotion of, I guess, feeling of getting closer to this currently out of reach loved one than you've been able to get previously. And in this reunion that you'd like to last longer, but you know will have to be fleetingly short. And if you listen to this EP immediately after the rest of the album, this might make for an even better closer to the whole experience than The End Prague Radio was. Pretty much agree with all of the hype that I have seen other people level at it. I'm not sure if it's my favorite track on the soundtrack overall, but it's easy top 3 at least. So that is finally everything to go through on the Machinarium soundtrack. Jesus, this was so much to go through. I was not expecting this video to require so much work when it first got sent in. No promises that I do this for every soundtrack request I get sent, but going forward. And as for how I feel on the Machinarium soundtrack album as a whole, after all the journey I've gone through going so in-depth for this video, I'm gonna be honest, I'm still about as conflicted on the album as I am on the game itself. I'm feeling like it's very close to proper greatness for me, but it comes up a little short of properly hitting that level. While the album obviously grew on me a lot after I played the game and I could wrap my head around the emotional beats it was actually designed for, some of the problems I had with the album on first listen before playing the game are still kinda there, in that there are parts that occasionally run together or fall into the background or bounce off me. This album, while a very well-produced collection of low-key IDM and ambience that's very nice and immersive, is actually kind of all over the place and has specific moments that hit way more for me than others. The Bottom, the Sea, the Glasshouse with Butterfly, the Black Hat Brotherhood theme, the End Prague Radio, those 5 are all absolute home runs that make it worth the experience on their own. And if you add the bonus EP at the end, which brings in even more home runs like Pipe Wrench, Dubstep, and By the Wall, that could just barely scrape the album into great territory for me. But there's just as many tracks on this album like The Prison or The Elevator or Clockwise Operetta that, while very effective in the game, just kind of feel like filler in the context of a regular album and I don't really have any particularly strong feelings on. They're soundtrack cues. They're the kind of thing that work better in the context of the game, but not as much as standalone pieces. And I think that seems like a pretty close mirror to my feelings on the game itself, you know, having this brilliant foundation with its art style and environment, but also has a whole bunch of distractions that kind of got in the way, and maybe not really sure how much I'll want to come back to it. Also very much the kind of thing that I feel like for me to have gotten the maximum amount of mileage out of it, I'd have needed to have discovered it in high school and thereby build up longer-term nostalgia for it, as I'm sure many other people of my age group and demographic already have. But despite all my many conflicted feelings on the experiences I got out of Machinarium and its soundtrack, I think I've sufficiently immersed myself in it enough to understand exactly where all the near-universal widespread acclaim for it came from. On a personal level, just as the game isn't likely to stick with me on the level of something like Matthew Skutnik's Slice of Sea, which I feel is very similar but executed even better in my opinion, this album isn't going to stick with me on the level that Floex's Zoria album did. Which, yes, that does kind of stand to reason. Zoria was designed with attentive listening in mind, and this is just a soundtrack. But they do still have a very similar appeal through their instrumental density and emotional depth, and the best parts of this soundtrack can very much hit the same heights as the best parts of Zoria. So, yeah, I mean, even if my own life was not changed by this, if it changed your life, I think I would get why. So on this album, I think I'm personally feeling a 7.7 out of 10. If you include the bonus EP on the end, though, you can maybe bump it up to a solid 8. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. Shout out to my Patreon supporters. They're awesome people. You want to add yourself to that list or make me review something, link to my Patreon is in the description. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.